basically what he identifies is what he sees as a fundamental contradiction between democracy and liberalism, which is obviously very counterintuitive to how most people think. Most people think, they equate the two things, and like, now, basically China's not a democracy, Russia's not a democracy, Iran's not a democracy, etc., because they're not liberal. And this seems to be, according to like Freedom House or the Atlantic Council or CNN, there is no difference between liberalism and democracy. But actually, according to the Atlantic Council, to bring them up, also the biggest threat to liberalism is apparently something called populism, which sounds an awful lot like democracy to me.
Yes.
So this is Schmidt's point, that fundamentally, in his reading of Rousseau, he says, Rousseau obviously takes social contract theory, and obviously that's an already established tradition, most famously, like the Hobbesian interpretation. And the social contract concept of society is that you imagine a bunch of individuals, and they exist in a state of nature. They don't have any kind of basically pre-organized rules of engagement with one another, and so they're competing over scarce resources, and they're trying to assert themselves in their own individual self-interest, according to the liberal model of the subject. And obviously this is bad, because war of all against all, total anarchy, this is very unproductive. We can't, society needs to kind of figure out how to cooperate. And so we come together and we draw up a social contract. We give everyone property rights, and we give the state the rights to enforce itself over us, which is why Hobbes wasn't really a liberal per se. He was an absolutist.
Yes.
But that basic principle that society is composed out of a procedure between, basically disparate factions, that there's conflict, is the essence of the human condition, is the essence of society, and society is a kind of a perpetual kind of pause button that has been put on this conflict that's always festering under the surface. This is what liberalism is about with its procedures. It's all about, different minorities, different factions entering into a kind of controlled parliamentary contest to determine how the state should fundamentally exist. Whereas this is counterposed with, in Rousseau, the concept of the general will,
right,
where the general will, which is the essence of democracy, this is, for Schmitt, totally in contradiction with this liberal concept of society. Because for Rousseau, if you want to understand, and the best example of this is like Hegelian political philosophy, which is, if you want to understand the general will, it's not the general will is not just like the amalgam of individual wills. Like we just like the sum total of every individual's wants comes together, and that's the general will. No, the general will is basically requires you to develop civic consciousness. It requires you to think about what is good for society rather than you as an individual. And insofar as you're acting in your self-interest, you're not having anything to do with the general will. So for Rousseau, it's possible that you could take a vote and people could all vote in their self-interest, and the general will would lose the vote. So the general will, which kind of got elaborated, as I said, in Hegelian philosophy and other like illiberal tendencies in modern political discourse, this is something that doesn't comport with liberalism, because it's fundamentally about identity. For Schmitt,
right,
democracy is about the identity of the people with their government, and vice versa. Whereas liberalism is this idea that there is no identity that the people can have with their government. That would be tyrannical. That would be something called the tyranny of the majority. And so instead, we need to make sure that we have all these individual rights, and all these different minorities are given their proper place. And obviously this is very good if you're very wealthy, or you're Jewish, or whatever.
Yeah.
Right.